Hello and welcome to this video about Russian civil aviation, prompted by your comments after my last appearance on LCI. Russia has stolen hundreds of Airbus and Boeing planes, operating them illegally or dismantling them for spare parts. There has also been an explosion in the number of aviation safety incidents, and now even the return to service of planes that were sometimes retired decades ago. Failed attempts to restart civil aviation production. First, watch this video, then I'll share more details.
In Russia, since they can't buy or manufacture new planes, airlines are trying to rehabilitate old aircraft that have already been retired. This is proof that despite its increasing industrial isolation, Moscow wants to maintain its air traffic. Obviously, Russia is such a vast country that its domestic traffic can't go without planes to fly from Moscow, let's say, to Vladivostok, even while suffering from sanctions. A major Russian daily revealed this, so Moscow isn't hiding it. But Titleman, we need your insights. Because here we're talking about Tupolev FDV models, Tupolev FDV, Ilyushin FDV, which are being brought back to life, if I may say so, since the war in Ukraine began. But now it's becoming really critical, because these planes are over 30 years old.
If they were just 30 years old, it would still be fine. There are much older planes, but they've reached their limits. Because we ask ourselves questions about Russian assets, but the Russians didn't hesitate to block our planes. Billions of euros worth of planes that belong to European companies, leasing companies and so on, were blocked, and they did what we call cannibalization.
They're stuck there in Russia, and as a result they're being cannibalized. That means their parts are being used to service other planes. That's obviously the reason why they grounded them.
Explain that to us, since they were blocked from the start of the war.
They banned these planes from leaving Russia to use them for spare parts.
There were no sanctions on February 22nd, 23rd, or 25th.
The Russians prevented the planes from departing.
How many planes are there? That's very interesting.
And
of different
Western companies.
They're mostly Russian companies, but they don't own their planes, that's it. They're called lessors, and most are European or American. Billions of euros from European and American companies are stuck in Russia. That's what I mean. With European sanctions, we don't allow ourselves that. But for the Russians, it's open bar on their side. And so once they've reached the limit with these planes that today no longer have spare parts. The Russian Civil Aviation Authority said the Chinese wouldn't help, so they're buying parts through India at 10 times the price, but it's becoming unsustainable. Despite over $2 billion a year from the Russian state supporting these companies in India, they can't sustain operations, so they resort to using older, more dangerous planes from storage. They have increased the number of aviation safety incidents by 40 times since the beginning of the war, because they keep flying planes that are from the Middle Ages.
Julian Colling, you just came back from Moscow. You lived there for a long time. Have you noticed this in recent years on domestic flights? Is that right? Does that make the Russian population travel less?
What was I going to say? We often discuss the war's impact on Russian society, but a less discussed aspect is aviation, since it's not a direct economic sanction. As someone who lived in Moscow for 8 years until recently, I can say this may be how Russians feel the war most. Russians often say they can't fly safely. I still have friends in Moscow
who are afraid of.
They avoid long-haul flights and take the train instead, even if it takes 2 or 3 days. Many now prefer trains over flying, and a real psychosis is starting in Russia. Planes are becoming increasingly worn out, aren't being repaired, and can't be cannibalized for parts as much anymore. That's a somewhat underestimated effect on both Russian tourism and the economy. Airlines in Russia have fewer flights, and there is real fear about long-haul travel, causing both psychological and economic effects.
The aviation safety statistics, even back in the Soviet era, now they're bringing out Soviet planes that in some cases have been sitting in hangars for decades. So the statistics for the national airline are dramatic, and now today they're bringing out planes that are dramatically bad. They need to replace planes that haven't flown in years and have been left in decaying hangars. I have an incredible statistic for you.
They ordered new planes from their national manufacturer.
And after 3 years
even after they're released, they still can't produce them. For example, the Sukhoi Superjet uses French engines like the Sukhoi Superjet SAN, but it's supposed to be equipped with the PD-21 engine. The jet engines are French actually, and all the avionics are European and American. They're missing a lot of spare parts, so for the past 3 or 4 years, they've tried to compensate by trying to make things internally. Let me remind you of something. When Russia was selling fighter jets, and fighter jets are what they do best. For example, the Sukhoi XXV was sold to Indonesia with French components and optics. In 2022, after losing access to French optics, they offered to sell Sukhois with Russian optics instead. The Indonesians considered this and responded.
They stopped buying?
They stopped buying and gave up, but decided to buy Rafale, which displeased Rafale's boss. The same plane had the same issue in Egypt, and it's far worse in civil than military aviation.
So the sanctions are really starting to have an effect in Russia.
Let's return to the main point about Russia in March 2022. It passed emergency laws that allow Russian airlines to locally re-register planes that were leased from abroad, and the goal is not to return them to the leasing companies. As a result, the majority of Airbus and Boeing planes that were operated by Russian airlines are effectively stuck in Russia. And it is estimated that they have thus blocked between 500 and 515 Airbus and Boeing planes for a total amount that represents $12 billion. But since these lessors couldn't recover their planes or collect the rent because they themselves had taken out loans, they found themselves in a very fragile economic situation. They turned to the insurance companies, and since they also had war risk insurance, well, the insurers had to cover these losses. For instance, Air Lease received $130 million for their company alone. 0.7 billion is included in this amicable settlement for Avalon lessors, as these planes are considered lost due to Russian government actions. It is estimated that insurers will have to pay about $15 billion to the companies that leased the planes that have now been stolen by the Russians. Why does this matter? Well, simply because it means that insurance premiums for all airlines, especially European airlines, have increased by between 20 and 40%. This means your airlines will face tens of millions of euros more in general expenses. It falls on you, poor little user of the aircraft, the airplane, the airline. The price of your ticket has increased because the Russians stole airplanes and the cost of insurance had to go up. And I want to emphasize again this fact. Russia blocks the properties of foreign private companies whenever it suits them. And we still don't allow ourselves to use the frozen Russian assets here on our soil. Because we have to protect Russia's sovereignty. Russia's sovereignty is one thing, but for me it's something else. If a country doesn't respect its neighbor's sovereignty, we shouldn't respect its sovereignty either. I don't see how he can justify violating Ukrainian sovereignty while insisting we respect theirs. Anyway, beyond the financial aspect, what did they do with those planes? First of all, apparently there are 80 of those Airbuses and Boeings that are now completely unfit for service, grounded. Simply put, they were used as a spare parts stockpile to find missing components. To keep the other planes flying, spare parts, worn out, old, that continue to be used in this way. Russian authorities say 139 planes and 200 helicopters must be retired by 2030 due to spare parts shortages. That's why these old Soviet planes are being returned to service, starting from post-Soviet Russia. But with older aircraft, especially the Tupolev 204 and 214, Ilyushin 96 and Antonov 24 and 26. These are Ukrainian planes, most of which have been stored in hangars for decades since they were taken out of service because they were no longer efficient or safe enough. In any case, they were never certified by European air safety authorities, European Union Aviation Safety Agency, or by the United States with the FAA. That means they can't leave Russian territory. Because these planes simply don't meet the standards, even China doesn't allow them to operate regular commercial flights. Simply put, these aircraft aren't up to standard. These aircraft were maintained during the Soviet era, partly by Ukrainian factories. Now things like engines and avionics will be missing. Planes stored for decades in hangars or warehouses will now be used without access to their original spare parts. It's complicated, so maintenance is a big issue. Russia complained about lacking China's support at the war's start and still doesn't have it. So, Russia is using fake spare parts of lower quality, which are sometimes produced locally, but they're also importing parts that sometimes come from what are called joint cards. They're getting old spare parts from aircraft scrapyards through indirect channels, or sometimes new parts. But in that case, the price is going to be much higher than normal, so much so that the Russian government has to subsidize maintenance to the tune of $43 million this year. And what's the consequence of these bad practices? Obviously, it's a surge in aviation safety incidents, since these planes aren't up to standard and they don't comply with all the usual regulations. There were 61 aviation safety incidents in 2022, and we're already at over 800 in 2025. That's only for cases we can find online, since Russia stopped sharing real statistics. At a minimum, that's a 13-fold increase in the number of incidents, whereas back then they were transparent and now they're not anymore. Aviation safety incidents are estimated to be 40 times higher than before the war. This rise in incidents is occurring even as total flights have decreased. So, Russia. The other option is obviously to try to produce and buy planes that would be Russian for Russians, but that doesn't exist. Russia, for example, had developed the Sukhoi Superjet. And this plane was not only a commercial failure even in Russia, since they were only producing one plane per month in 2021, and so, following the war, they wanted to buy more, but in the end, they only produced 2 in 2023, then 0 after that. Then there's the Irkut MC-21, which you might know if you watched the channel back when I was doing the press reviews, and it was meant to be an equivalent or even a superior plane to the Airbus A321neo A330-737 MAX. Except that many key components of the plane are foreign, especially the Pratt and Whitney engines, its avionics, and the composite materials for the wing. Due to 2 waves of sanctions, these components are now unavailable. The plane was set to be operational in 2016, but after Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, they lost access to key technologies and could no longer produce the aircraft. They had to, and in 2022, lost everything else they were missing. Russia then tried to replace the needed equipment domestically. But development is slow and imperfect, and the result today is a plane that is overweight, with performance that is much lower compared to what was planned in the initial version. The certification campaigns must be nearly redone and lack credibility compared to Airbus and Boeing. The first operational delivery of the aircraft to a Russian airline is scheduled for this year, but it won't be allowed to fly abroad. And they certainly won't be able to produce more than a few units per year, compared to Airbus alone, which makes more than 50 planes per month. However, Russia can't meet the same quality and efficiency standards. Without digitalization, they also lack quality control monitoring. There is a risk of a lot of production and design defects, especially for a plane that was certified hastily, so it's very likely that this plane is not reliable. Despite the SSJ, without the Sukhoi Superjet, still having international support at the time, it still had a very low level of reliability, with accidents and below average availability. That's what killed it, and it's very likely that this plane will suffer the same fate. The MC-21 won't be any better, especially now, if their engines are entirely Russian, which is a challenge in Russia since it's far behind in these technologies. In any case, the Russian air transport sector is being propped up by Russia with $12 billion in subsidies, allocated in 2022 and 2023, with another 40 billion rubles in 2024. By early 2025, 26 billion rubles were added, though figures are incomplete. That doesn't prevent about 30 Russian airlines from being on the verge of bankruptcy. In this field, as in many sectors, Russians are nearly starving and their economy is struggling badly. I made a video about this question and included a link for you to watch. It's a few months old. Most elements are fundamental and accurate. We're just seeing this situation continue. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this little update, and I'll see you very soon.